What's up, everyone, and welcome to our Section 1A football teams preview, where we'll be talking about all the teams in the league, kind of giving a small overview of all of them, as well as kind of where we see the league going. Now, this ain't going to be predictions. We have predictions, say, for our Patreon members, but we want to welcome all of you. We really do appreciate you guys for tuning in. As always, I am your host, Frank Langella, joined by my co-host, Marsilio Langella. Mars, we are right back in the thick of things. Games in a couple days.
It has been a fast summer, but I feel like it's crazy that we're starting a week later. And I mentioned this in the other video that, normally Labor Day weekend marks the start of week 1, but we're only in week 0, right? Which is a weird feeling as a longtime player and coach in Section 1. So, it's a good feeling we're back, but it's a weird feeling of where everything lies.
Absolutely. And again, this is our teams preview, where we'll be talking about the different teams, some of the discussions we have with the coaches, some of what we're seeing from the teams as we head into this season. And again, if we don't talk about everyone, it's not because we don't think that they're not good players, but again, this is just our opinions. And before we dive into it, if you haven't done so yet, make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe for our channel. This is where we drop a bunch of our content on YouTube for all of you guys. And also consider joining our Patreon for some added benefits. It really does help support our cause. But with that said, Mars, let's talk about the league overall. And there's a lot of changes in A. Again, there's still 13 teams this year compared to 12 that was last year. But you have Lakeland, Rye, Nyack coming back into A. You have Greeley and Pelham leaving, right? So definitely a little bit of a different look for A this year. And, I first want to start off by bringing up kind of a LWH Hood survey of, at Media Day, which I thought has been a pretty good thing the last couple of years for Section 1 football. Now, they run a poll from the coaches and players on who they think is going to win the section title game. And you can see on the screen, Mars, it's pretty consistent on the big three, I call them, which is Somers, Rye, and Harrison. And you can see that in the top three. And then things kind of slightly change. You do see Yorktown, but they're as number 4 on both. But that's when things change a little bit. And it's pretty obvious who everyone considers to be this big three. And we'll talk about that. But let's start, again, the league is divided into two things. There's a North League and a South League. And we'll start with the North League. And first up is Brewster. And, when we talk about Brewster, they went 4-5 last year. They did just miss the playoffs. And the last 5 years, they're 22-20, right? So they've been hovering around like the 500 mark. Some years they've been really strong, some years not so much. And the last 3 years, they're 13 and 14, right? So slightly under 500 the last 3 years. And offensively, I think that's when the big thing struggled last year. Because when you look at them offensively, Mars, they were last in the league in points scored in the regular season. They were 12 out of 12. They do return 4 of their starters, 1 on the offensive line. So, again, a lot of turnover here on that offensive line. Interested to see how this offensive line comes together. Now, the quarterback that came back rotated in the lineup in Dillon, so they do bring some veteran presence back at the quarterback spot, but a lot to improve on the offensive side. And it then starts with being consistent on first and second down. Defensively, though, they were definitely a little bit better on the defensive side of the ball, and they're returning 5 of their 11 starters. So the big thing that Coach talked about offensively, they have to be more consistent defensively to avoid those mental breakdowns and be better at communicating. So that's going to be something that I'm interested in seeing from this team. And Coach did talk with a lot of confidence. He talked about wanting to make the playoffs. So that's going to be what's really interesting. A couple names to keep an eye on. Quarterback KJ Dillon. This was a young man who, again, he's coming in as a junior, so he was a sophomore, really green, really young. So there was a lot of mistakes and a lot of growing pains that he had to go through. And I'm interested to see that jump he goes from his sophomore to junior year, because that could be really important for this team. Nick Smith is a senior. There's a guy on the wide receiver defensive back. Very active two-way player. Marco Perello is another one, wide receiver and defensive back, the senior. So a couple skill guys, couple guys at the defensive back spot that can really help. Josh Walker is another person. But a guy I want to bring up, Mars, Harrison Smith, tall wide receiver. This could be another big weapon for Dillon to make some big plays. He stood out on tape as a nice route runner with some soft hands. But Luke Johnson on the offensive line and defensive line, big-bodied kid, strong. This is somebody who, again, they're really going to need him to be an anchor on both sides of the front for this team, for them to make that push. Again, in this A-League, Mars, you have to be strong up front to compete with guys like Somers and Yorktown. So, again, that's going to be the key for Brewster, is how they build this offensive line. The second team And again, we try to do this in alphabetical order, so there's not a specific order here for everybody. The next thing I want to talk about is one of my sleepers, is Fox Lane, right? So Fox Lane, they went 4-4 last year. They made the playoffs. They lost to Eastchester in the quarters. And they had that huge victory, I remember, against MayPac. Tight game all the way to the end to get themselves in the playoffs. So that was a huge moment for Fox Lane to clinch themselves, to get into the playoffs. It was a nice moment for them. Offensively, they were 8th out of 12th in points scored in the regular season, but they're bringing back some veteran players. 6 out of 11 starters returning, 2 out of 5 on the offensive line, and they're bringing back their quarterback, which is again really important. John Zernick, which I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but 3-year starter for Fox Lane going into his 3rd year. So that's going to be really important. They got to be better at scoring in the red zone, protecting the football. They did struggle at times where they would move the ball and not be able to finish. So that's going to be a really emphasis. Defensively, Mars, this was a strong defense last year. They were 6 out of 12 in points allowed. At times, are really, really strong, and they're returning 6 of 11 starters. So to me, defense could be a pretty strong group for them. Now, they have to replace a guy like Bailey on that offensive and defensive line, who is a big, that's a big void to fill. But let's talk about a couple players. I mentioned their quarterback, 3-year starter. At times, he can run the ball. At times, he can throw the ball. Really interested to see him. Can he take that next step forward? Turnovers at times were really costly for them. So it's going to be really important for him, again, to take that next step and be smarter with the football. But Declan Connors, running back and safety, another 3-year starter for them. Really impressive running back. He's really shifty. And at the defensive back spot, I thought he was a really strong safety for them. He can tackle in space, cover. So there's Cam Bahari, who, again, was kind of a fullback last year, moving to the offensive line. Strong kid. Will Rudolph, Logan Mamolia, 2 big wide receivers. You know, Will Rudolph is a D1 baseball commit. So you can see multi-sport athlete, really strong a football player as well. Those are going to be some key guys for this team. Mars, any thoughts on those first 2 teams I mentioned?
Yeah, I feel like Fox Lane is definitely going to be a surprise team. I know that there's a lot of people that are overlooking Fox Lane in a way, but when you have athletes on your squad and you have a lot of guys returning, and not just returners as juniors, but they've been playing for 3 years, and you know they've been playing consistently for 3 years. I feel like you're going to have a pretty solid set of guys that know what the program is about, know how to win games, and they've only improved since those guys have started from 2022 to 2023 to now 2024. You were expecting for a bigger jump to happen. So, you know, like I said, that game against MayPac was a big win for Fox Lane to get them into the playoffs. So you're only expecting that to really happen again. So Declan Connors is definitely a guy I'm looking at, but Fox Lane can be dangerous this year. We got to see what they do with their offensive line.
Yes, absolutely. That's going to be a huge key factor here. So let's move now to the next one, and that is John J. Cross River, coached by Coach Kando, excuse me. And this team went 4-5 last year. They did not make the playoffs. And I tell you, you know, they're, 13-14 the last 3 years. The year prior, they went to the semifinals. They had that huge upset over Clarkstown South. So this is a team that trying to make a rebound and win some more football games. And offensively, they were 10 out of 12 in points scored in the regular season last year. They had a pretty young team. They had a bunch of seniors, but they had some young starters in key spots. And they are bringing back 5 of those starters, 3 on the offensive line, and their quarterback in Tommy Machado. And he is, you know, Coach really raved about how dynamic of an athlete he is. And I liked him on tape. He showed pretty good timing on some of these deep routes and really improved on the short game as the season went along. So one thing that he needed to work on was get stronger. And Coach talked about how hard he's worked in the offseason. He could be really dynamic for this team. And if they are going to go places, it's because of guys like Tommy Machado really taking that next step forward. Defensively, they have 6 of 11 starters returning. Coach mentioned that they did a much better job in fundamentals last season, and now he really wants to see them try to create some turnovers and continue to grow. They're a multiple defense. So a couple guys I mentioned, Tommy Machado, Patrick Ryan is another guy at the wide receiver spot. He was a sophomore last year. They really think that he can explode this time around, this season, making that big jump. Manny Ruiz is another big and lanky wide receiver. So there's going to be some targets for Tommy Machado. The big question is, Mars, on that offensive line, right? Again, talking about competing, have a couple guys coming back. They're not going to be huge guys, right? They're not going to have a huge offensive line, but are they going to be tough, gritty, and be able to withstand some of the bigger teams that they play against is going to be a big question for me. Let's talk about Lakeland. And coached by Coach Schilling, they were in B last year, had a really strong season. They went 6-4. They lost to Pleasantville in the semifinals in Class B. Now they return to A. And, 6 wins last year, Mars, was the most that they had since 2004. So a real nice season that they've had. Now they've gone 500 above 2 straight years. So pretty good job the last 2 years. And when you look at this team, though, they're going to be replacing some big-time players. Now, offensively, they were really strong in B. They were 5 out of the 17 teams in points scored. They're returning 5 starters, and the big thing for me is they're returning 3 on the offensive line. But they lost a stud quarterback. They lost a couple stud wide receivers, so a lot of questions around the other guys, and they're having a quarterback battle. Don't know the result of that quarterback battle, but they've had a quarterback with Savastano and Lapruta at the quarterback spot, so interested to see who won that. Defensively, only 2 of 11 starters coming back, so a lot of key defensive guys are going to have to be replaced going into this season. So interested to see, where things go. They had to replace 16 seniors, so it's a lot of key guys that are not returning. So a lot of question marks. And a couple guys to keep an eye on. Nick Oliva at the linebacker spot, super active linebacker, had over 60 tackles last year, 6 tackles for loss. This is a young man who is super active, always around the football. He also had 3 INTs. But a couple guys up front, Kyle Ronk, he's a left tackle and defensive lineman. He's going to be his 3rd year starting at the tackle spot. He's going to be so important to anchor down that. He's one of the, I think, bigger prospects that Lakeland has. Nicholas Ferrante at the defensive end. He also plays on the offensive line. He was a Frank's finest on the D-line. 6 sacks last year, 10 tackles for loss. He's a very explosive off the edge for his team. So those are a couple guys, and Robbie Policastro at the running back spot. Look for them as the quarterbacks battle out to try to run the ball a little bit more, right? And this is a veteran running back coming back for them. And Anthony Fabrosi is another one at that wide receiver. In a crowd of wide receivers, the one that kind of stood out to me as a returner. Mars, thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like Lakeland last year had a really good season, and obviously having that 6 wins is big, especially getting into the playoffs and being very competitive throughout the entirety of the year in B. But the question is going to be about how do they kind of transition by losing all these different backs, and how could they really continue that star power that they had? And I think the biggest thing I look at right off the bat is they're returning offensive linemen. And obviously, when you're looking at the Hogs up front, Kyle Ronk is a key member of that line, and it's going to be about guys who can really fill in, because you mentioned before that Coach Schilling has mentioned that they're going to look into maybe running the ball a little bit more, and because they have a little bit less of the star power in receiving and it's a question mark about quarterbacks and all that stuff. So it's going to be a lot more about the offensive line and what they can do to really open up the lanes to become more of not saying it'll become a only run team. It's just establishing that run game.
Coach Schilling, I don't think could be an only run team.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't think he can ever just do that. But the idea of establishing the run game, opening up more in the past because of that, and I feel like that's what Lakeland's recipe to success could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the next team, and that's MayPac. Last year, MayPac went 6-4. They lost to Harrison in the quarters. It feels like Harrison has been that thorn in their side. They've lost to Harrison in the quarters the last 2 years now, right? So here we go for MayPac. Once again, they have made the playoffs the last 3 seasons, so that's pretty good. 3 playoff appearances in the last 7 years, right? And they all occurred in the last 3 years. So it feels like they're headed in that right spot going into the playoffs. Now, the big question that I have for them is they are returning some offensive linemen, which is going to be huge in this league, right? So up front, guys like Landon Varley is going to be so important. He is a Frank's finest D lineman. He's such an important 2-way player, probably their best player, if I'm going to be honest, watching them on tape. So he's going to be so important. But, Dean Ulaj is another offensive lineman, big kid. I think he's like 6'3", 230 pounds. So a couple of these, Matt Bentavega, offensive center. So a couple of returning offensive linemen, that's a good start. The question is, who is it going to be the quarterback, right? How is the quarterback position is going to develop? And the second is, the Koches have been the identity of this offense, in my opinion, the last 2+ years. So again, this is who takes that mantle, right, is going to be the question, because they used Koch in the running game, as a receiver, as a returner. Those, they don't grow on trees. So, a guy like Nate Maskell probably is someone to try to help fill that void. That's going to be, to me, one of the biggest questions that I see for MayPac. But it's always good to have a strong front. So we'll leave that there. Now the next one, this is going to be, again, really important. Somers, the favorite. So we finally get to Somers, and we talked about all these teams, and there's one team that is kind of like the King Kong, I would call it, Mars, of A, or the Godzilla, whatever kind of, monster you want to talk about, the one that has kind of been reigning tyranny over this class. Now, their last 4 years, Mars, they are 44-2. So they have won the section title, 3 straight years. Probably would have been, they won that championship, what we call like the COVID year. They won that as well, but that wasn't a section title game. But they won the section title 3 straight years, an unbelievable streak these last 4 years. Like, it's unheard of. They have had 8 straight 6 or more win seasons. So it's just been absolutely crazy, the type of a streak that Somers has been on. And offensively, when you look at this team, they got to replace a lot of starters. On offense, 3 of 11 starters are coming back, 1 out of 5 on the offensive line, including replacing their quarterback. Now, I say these as returning starters, but, Somers is that team, that program where, there's guys probably behind them, but the only reason they're behind some of these seniors is because the seniors are talented and they're underclassmen, and so they could be taking that next step forward. But the question is, you just don't really know, but they could become stars right out of the gate, right? And they are returning a couple guys who really stand out. Defensively, 4 out of 11 starters coming back. So a lot of new faces are going to have to make some big plays for this team. Another bad thing is Nate Mitchell, who was a talented linebacker and got reps at running back, he suffered an injury before the year, right? So again, those are always devastating. But Somers is that next man up program at this point. And a couple guys that definitely keep an eye on. We know about guys like Mason Kelly, right? I mean, he's a stud running back. He can do multiple things for you. Good receiving back, good pass pro back as well. You don't get a lot of that very often. Miguel Iglesias, is moving to the quarterback spot. And now this young man is not the 6'4" power running quarterback, going to bomb it deep all the time, but a supremely good athlete. And this is a guy you're probably going to see more of these kind of zone read concepts, these kind of quarterback counter stuff, using his speed and athleticism in the running game. And he did show the ability he can. I mean, they moved him all over the field last year, running back, wide receiver. He was a big-time defensive back, and he made plays for Somers all over the place. So I'm not questioning the athleticism is there. Might be a different style of offense, but the athleticism, you're going to see this young man can really bring it. Dean Palazzolo at the wide receiver spot, stud wide receiver. I mentioned him as a Frank's finest. You want to break down on him, I got it there, but this is a guy who can really burn you in vertical concepts, and they'll take those quick slants and take it to the house. But a guy, Ben Harris, offensive lineman, he's one of the returning guys up front, really going to have to anchor things down. I mean, that's going to be huge for them. So to me, I'm looking at guys like Ben Harris, R.J. Peterson, Dylan Kozinski, Matt Razine. Who is going to really step up front for the Somers? Because that's what they've been so dominant at, Mars, right? They've really run the league because they've always won the trenches on the offensive line and in the defensive front 7. Linebacker's another one, right? So I'm interested to see what happens there. Aiden Cooligan at the safety spot. This could be a really strong secondary. So keep an eye on them. The passing teams might have a real tough time. We're going to see, can teams run the football against probably an inexperienced defensive line and linebacker group. Mars, thoughts?
I mean, Somers is obviously, whether you want to call him Godzilla, King Kong, King Ghidorah, I don't know what you want to call them. Whatever monster they are, they have been running amok, and they have been untouched.
They really have.
They've been untouched, and the only team that might have been able to touch them was Rye, and they were in B last year. So that was the only other team that I could see that can get to that level. Harrison had a really good game against them, and obviously the sectional, but it was, I feel like they just had so much firepower that they're hitting on all cylinders. And so the question always is, they lost a lot of players. Are they going to be the same Somers team? And for the past 3 years, more than that, but the past few years, that same story has been happening every single time. and they've always pumped out really good teams. So I really would be surprised if there was an issue when it comes to these juniors stepping into these senior roles. But they have a lot of really good players that are really stepping up. And I think, like you said, maybe the offense is going to look a little different. Like you said before, Dean Palazzolo. Sorry for butchering your name, but he's been an absolute beast, right? And I think he's just been a phenom when it comes to his speed.
You don't know his name, but you know his number.
I know
everyone all over the field.
Everyone knows who he is. I just can't say your name. But the idea is that you've been an absolute tank, and the idea that people can cover him is really unheard of. I really don't see a lot of people covering him man to man. And I'm surprised that teams haven't bracketed him more often. And even when they try to, sometimes it doesn't even matter. So that's why when you have players like that, it's really hard to defend. And Somers already has a plethora of athletes that can really be game breakers. So yes, they lost some starters, but it feels like it's almost like a plug and play. And a lot of these kids are athletes that could just step up. So Somers is still going to run amok from what it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. Next up, let's talk about probably one of my, what I would call probably one of my biggest contenders, right? When we talk about on each side, we have kind of like this big three we talked about in the beginning. Somers is one of those big three, but Yorktown is one of those teams that I can think be a contender in the league. And last year they were 8-2. They lost to Harrison in a really close semifinals game, and that's actually their week 0 opponent this upcoming week. So again, really great game that's coming up this week. But this is a team, they're 18-10 over the last 3 years. 8 wins last year was the most in 2019. Offensively, this was the number 1 offense in points scored in the regular season last year in A. And they are bringing back 5 of their starters, 3 on the offensive line, and their quarterback in Gonzalez. And Caden Gonzalez, obviously a prolific quarterback, broke 3 school records. This is a guy who really grew with his anticipation, his ability to drive the football down the field, maneuvering the pocket. So, you got to feel good getting some of those veteran guys up front and your starting quarterback back. The question is going to be, though, they lost a lot of skill guys. So that's going to be one of the biggest questions. They want to be, speaking to coach, more balanced to help open up the play action more. So finding the running game is going to be really important. They also had a really strong defense, Mars. They were tied for second in points allowed in the regular season, 3 out of 11 starters coming back. So there's definitely going to be some defensive guys and some skill guys that are going to have to step up this year to replace some stud players. Now, to me, some of the players to watch, we mentioned Caden Gonzalez is an obvious one. And not a lot of guys like to talk about the guys up front, but I will, because it's going to be so important in Class A if you're going to compete for a title or play against those big guys like Somers and Rye. You got Tyler, you got Dennis Mitchell, who to me was a Frank's finest offensive lineman, quiet kid, strong technique, stood out on tape, as somebody who can do multiple things for you on the offensive line. He can play multiple positions on the offensive line. You have our Krenznicki, another returning offensive lineman, Mike Desiderio. So you got a nice, internally of your offensive line is pretty good, right? So you're returning a couple guys there. Baco Lori at the defensive line spot, Mars. He's a wrestler. He really does a good job of leverage, creating some penetration. So again, if they're going to compete, it's going to be up front. It's going to be huge. And a couple other, Chad Bowen on the defensive side at the linebacker spot. Yorktown had some really good linebackers last year. So again, interested to see him step into that role at the linebacker spot, make some plays. He was an outside linebacker. And then Tyler Galante, keep an eye on him. 3-sport athlete, really good instincts, made a lot of plays at the secondary, the free safety spot. Going to play a pivotal role on both sides of the ball this year. Mars, little quick thoughts on Yorktown as we move to the second league.
Yeah, I feel like last year they had a really solid team. Being number 1 in offense was a feat that they obviously were. I was the best team in A, which obviously was Somers. That's number 2 in offense. I mean, that when you're hitting that high level of scoring, I mean, that's incredible. But the question is going to be about how do they kind of return to that playoff sound squad when you do have a lot of missing pieces, right? And the question is going to be how do they rebound? And I feel like it's going to be on the shoulder or on the arm of Caden Gonzalez. I feel like he's going to be a guy that you're going to have to run the plays through. And he is just someone that I feel like can be a game breaker. It just is going to depend on the offense and defensive lines to really control that front on the offense and defensive sides. But Yorktown has some capabilities of doing that. I feel like they could definitely pull it off. They, like you said, they are maybe they're that number 4 team. I think on the polls they were number 4. So people recognize talent. They recognize what Yorktown has. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, let's move down to the South League, and this had one less team. So what's interesting is, for the North team, they have one crossover, and then they play everybody. And the South League actually has to find a second crossover. So they get to play one crossover, everyone in their league, and they got to find another crossover. So that's kind of how the schedule is a little bit different for them. But let's start with the first team, and that's Clarkstown North. Coached by Coach Strongone, who's been coaching there for a long time, a veteran coach there. And it was a struggle last year. They were 1-8, Mars. They didn't make the playoffs. The last time that they ended the season over 500 was 2018. So it's been a rough couple of years. A few years back, they did make the playoffs. They ended up being 5-5. But this is a team that is bringing back some of their players. 5 of 11 starters returning on the offensive side, which I think they were ahead of their defense. They were 9th in points scored. 3 on the offensive line. Now they do have to replace their quarterback, but they have a lot of confidence in Kavanaugh coming in, who was a wide receiver and defensive back. He's moving into the quarterback spot, and this is a very good athlete. So they're very intrigued to have that young man step in. When I spoke to Coach, they really talked about controlling the clock and limiting the big mistakes, which was a key thing. Defensively, they're also returning 5 starters, but they have to do a better job of winning third down. Stopping. They gave up some big time plays last year. They want to create more turnovers, pressuring the quarterback. So those are going to be the big things for Clarkstown North. I mentioned Kavanaugh being an important player to watch. Sion Berry, he was a Frank's finest defensive back. This was a guy who made a lot of plays on the back end of that defense. He showed nice range. He showed a good job at reading the quarterback. He's going to play an important part at the halfback spot as well. Patrick Benke, he's been there multiple years now, starter on that offensive line and defensive line is going to be really important. And then you have guys like Ryan Colopy, running back and linebacker. Sam Garcia, running back and linebacker. So coaches, he mentioned to me looking for that next workhorse. And so I'm interested to see some of these names try to establish themselves heading into this upcoming season. Next up is the other Clarkstown team, Clarkstown South, Mars, and my other contender, in my opinion, in this South League going into the playoffs. Coached by Coach Scarpelli, who's also been coaching them for a very, very long time. But it was a struggle last year. They went 3-6. They did not make the playoffs, Mars. And last time they had 3 wins in a season, 2012, right? 2012. So, and the last time they had 5 losses in a season, they had 6, was 2009. So again, they've been on a real nice streak of getting wins together. Last year was a struggle. Now, I'm sure everyone is sick to their stomach, coaching staff, players. You know what the good news is? A lot of those players with that sickness in their stomach is coming back. So I imagine that they want to rectify what happened last year. And this is an offense that did move the ball, and they did score points. They were 4 out of 12 in points scored. They're returning 8 starters, Mars, including, I think, 3 or 4 on the offensive line. Now, they got to replace their quarterback. They have to replace their stud running back. But the turnovers were devastating for them last season. And obviously, that's going to be a huge emphasis, I imagine, coming into this year. Defensively, 7 of 11 starters coming back. So, turnovers and giving up big plays were the big bugaboo, I would call it, last year. And so if they can clean up some of that stuff, I think they have a really good chance. Quarterback is going to be obviously an important one, right? So we don't know that. But the guys around him on that offensive line, Angel Abreu, Jason Artizzoni, you got Antoine Samuels, Sawyer Carisco. So you got some guys up front with some veteran experience, some good size to them, and the skill guy, Johnny Oliveri. You got Kyle Sparing at the running back spot, Kyle Coughlin, and one of my favorite, Jacob Heedle, who's like a 6'3", 215-pound wide receiver, can't even move inside and play at the linebacker spot. So, to me, they have a lot of really talented football players. If they get that quarterback who can orchestrate things, Clarkstown South, Mars, can be that one of those under-the-radar contenders. I don't even know if you call them under the radar, but they could be a real contender coming out of that South League.
Yeah, I feel like South is the team I'm really interested in seeing how they do because, even if you look back in the past, 3-6 last year, which was obviously a low year, but previous year 7-2, previous year 6-4. They've always been above 500. They've always been a playoff team, and they have that drive. And usually when you have a team that struggles one year with a lot of returning players, they have a drive to say, we're not letting that ever happen again. And I feel like that is something that this team has a lot of momentum to them. I think you kind of say that they're under the radar. It's mainly because people aren't ranking them in the top. There's one rank, I think it was the coaching rank, that put them in the top 5. But maybe people are overlooking South. And I feel like that is something that if I was a player, I would say I love that of people not thinking about us. And then I would say, let's show them what we can do. And I feel like you have a lot of those players that are coming back, and 8 of 11 starters on offense, 7 of 11 on defense. I mean, all those guys are ready to go. So I'm interested to see what happens with South.
Yeah. Next up is Eastchester, coached by Coach DiCarlo. I think he's been coaching there since 2009. And they had a really impressive year last year. 7-3. They lost to Somers in the semifinals. Last 3 years, 17-11. And just to kind of put last year into context, the last time they had 7 wins in a season was 2015. So they had a really impressive. They were one of my favorite teams kind of watching last year. And offensively, they were third in A in points scored in the regular season. But they have to replace a lot of guys. 3 out of 11 starters are returning on the offense, 1 out of 5 on the offensive line. And obviously, they have to replace their stud quarterback from last year. And that's a competition between Robbie Maltese and Dylan Burdridge, the junior. So, and Robbie Maltese is a senior. So they're having a competition for the quarterback spot. Probably because of that competition, because of the uncertainty at quarterback, focus is probably going to be on running the ball a little bit more. So I would imagine that's going to be a big thing. They are returning one of their stud running backs, and then Ciafone, or Chiafone. I apologize but I do love him as a player. That's what I'm going to say. He's a 4-year varsity player for them. A really important two-way player. Defensively, Mars, Eastchester was the number 1 defense in points allowed in the regular season last year. Defensively, they were great. Now, they're also returning 3 of 11 starters. So, again, a lot of starters they have to replace on that defensive side. And Coach talked about it. It's probably their best defense since 2015 statistically. So, again, how do they replace these starters on defense? How do they replace Aiden Schultz? They're going to have a pretty young team, but could be a talented young team. I mentioned Vin Chiafone, a 4-year player for them. Tremendous linebacker. To me, probably one of the more versatile linebackers in the class, and at the running back spot, going to have to pick up a much bigger load carrying the football for them. Michael Provenzale, another guy to keep an eye on. 3-year varsity starter. He's a senior captain, wide receiver, and cornerback spot, and a guy to keep an eye on. Nick Martucci. He's a guy that their coaches have raved about as a really under the radar player. He's a junior, another 3-year player. He's been on the varsity multiple years. Kind of plays at this hybrid outside linebacker, strong safety, but also at the running back spot. You can line him up in the slot. He can make plays for you. He's going to be someone who could really pop off this year, so keep an eye on him. Next, let's talk about one of the big dogs, Mars, and that is Harrison. Coached by Coach Sirocco. He's been coaching there the last couple of years. They went 8-3. They lost to Somers in the Section 1 championship game. And what's really interesting to me is because Rye comes back from B, they're not even one of the most talked about teams. It's really Somers and Rye everyone's keep talking about. And Harrison is not so much an underdog, but not talked about in the same light as those other 2 big dogs. So if I'm a Harrison coach or player, I'm actually a little excited because, I'm not like the main target in A, and you're kind of going a little bit under the radar here. And offensively, they returned 4 of their 11 starters, 2 out of 5 on the offensive line. They do have to replace their quarterback, and Coach talked about how, one of their potential prospects in Jack Badner, who was a JV quarterback last year. It can also work in some Dante Lanza, who did some of their zone read, some of the option stuff for them, a really good running back for them. They have McLaughlin, who they lost, who was a stud wide receiver, but Joe Krupe also comes back. So you are getting some of those really talented guys who can make plays for you. Question is going to be some of those guys up front. And Coach talked about, again, being a little bit more consistent. They left a lot of plays on the field last year that they feel they should have had. But defensively, Mars, they were tied for second in points allowed in A. This was a really fun defense to watch, and they are returning 6 of 11 starters on that defense. So going to be huge. Now, another question I've always been asked about Harrison, which I do struggle with as well is depth. We talk about the offensive line, but depth is another thing. They have 30 kids this year. What's crazy? They had 28 last year and they made the section championship. So again, they have a couple more kids, but depth is always going to be a concern, especially when injuries come around. So to me, if Harrison can stay relatively healthy, they are one of the favorites. They are one of the top tier, the big three. They should be absolutely in that for good reason. And a couple players to watch. Arden Balidamaj, as an offensive and defensive lineman, one of the best in the section. So disruptive defensively, really strong hands, can control offensive linemen. And on the offensive line, the ball is going to really have to be the anchor for this offense. Another guy, Joe Krupe, made big-time plays. I remember a lot of people remember him returning kicks in the section final game. But he was a guy who made plays for them as a wide receiver, as a running back, very versatile player at the cornerback spot. He's really, really good. Another guy, one of my favorites to watch, is Dante Lanza, the Swiss Army knife of Harrison. This is a guy who kind of played at the halfback spot, played at the quarterback spot, and he was a really good safety for them. Really gritty, not a very big guy, but scrappy as hell, and I love those kind of players. Marco Marisi at the linebacker spot, coaches raved about him. Going to have to play a much bigger role on the offensive end, but he was a stud at the linebacker spot. Really, you have playmakers on each level of this defense, but they're not alone. Drew Haynes at the outside linebacker spot, Damian Nicolaj at the defensive end spot. A lot of guys who can make really, again, this defense could be really, really good. They can fill in a couple gaps. The question I have is, again, that offensive line and depth. That's my kind of spiel right there, Mars. What are your thoughts before I dive to the last two teams?
I feel like Harrison, we talked about how Harrison has been the, the kryptonite to MayPac every single playoff round, and it feels like Somers has been the kryptonite to Harrison the last 3 years when it comes to playoffs. So
they lost three straight years to
playoffs to Somers, and it's almost like they gotta beat their Goliath, which is Somers, in order for them to get and win into the section final. And I think it is a little disrespectful. And I caught myself being disrespectful a little bit, saying, hey, Rye's a top dog. I thought Rye would be able to compete. Harrison battled with Somers in the section final. A lot of people didn't think that was going to happen. And Harrison, I feel like, should feel disrespected in this league when people are overlooking them and saying, hey, Rye's back. We should thank Rye. Harrison has been that other top team that's been sitting in A, and they shouldn't. And obviously, there's already deeper blood there in the battle between those two. So it's already probably really rough for them to hear that. But they should take it almost like, all right, well, if you think that we can't handle ourselves, then we're going to show everyone. It almost should be like a motivational thing for Harrison. And I feel like I agree with you with the question mark being the offensive line in depth. The question is going to be, can their athletes stay healthy? And if they can stay healthy, I think they can have a really good year again. And I feel like the big battle is going to be between them and them and Rye. No longer a week 0 game. We have to now see them battling for not just in the game, but battle for the playoff spot too. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's talk about another team, which to me is an interesting, could be a sleeper, right? And that's Nyack, coming back from B into A, coached by Anthony DiMarisco, who is his first year, came from Albertus Magnus. They were 4-5 last year. They lost to Rye in the quarters in B. And to me, when you just pull up their 11 starters, this is a team I feel like could make some noise. Now, big question is they only have 25 players on the on varsity. Probably the smallest team in A, if you're just looking at the varsity roster as, the amount of players. But those starters that could be playing could be big for them. Offensively, they're returning 7 of those 11 starters, 2 on the offensive line, and their quarterback is returning in Tylen Williams, who, to me, a very impressive, big, strong, can throw the deep ball. So, again, a stud running back in Sean Claremont, who went over 1,000 total yards, powerful runner, one-cut guy. He's got a strong, stiff arm. That combination there could be pretty deadly in this league. Now, Armani Gonzalez, as an offensive lineman and defensive lineman, really going to have to anchor things down. We keep talking about winning the trenches in A is going to be so huge. But they also have, Austin Burgess, a very talented wide receiver and tight end. Abdul Dura Massini, a really good strong safety, also gets reps at the running back spot. And then finally, Connor Bierfeld, who's kind of this outside linebacker, who's a backup quarterback, but he was a stud on the defense. He had, I think, 11 sacks last year. So when you just pull up the starting group, Nyack really could, match up. It's just depth is a huge, huge question mark. A lot of kids are going to have to be playing both ways and on special. But you saw last year Harrison was able to accomplish that, right? So that's what makes Nyack pretty interesting to me. Finally, to wrap it all off, the other big, the elephant in the room, right? And that's Rye. Coming back from B, Mars, they won the Section B title. They won the state title. Now they return to A. Coached by Coach Gar, who's, I don't even know what career wins he's at right now. Is it 353? I don't even, he's got so many wins in under his helm. And, they're loaded again. The last 3 years, Mars, 32-6. So offensively last year in B, they were number 2 in points scored in the regular season. They're returning 5 of their starters, but 1 on the offensive line. And that's going to be Rye's big question. Similar to Somers, similar to Harrison, how do they shore up those fronts, which has always been a staple for them competing with teams, is their ability to win in the trenches. And this year is no different. They're also have to replace A.J. Miller, who was a prolific quarterback for them. Now, who steps in is his brother, and I think he wants to be called Boo Miller. I know his name is Carson, but I think I was corrected that he wants to be called Boo or Bo, and I apologize again. Don't have all that information, so I'll just call you Carson. You can correct me in the comments, but this is somebody who, again, was a big player for them in the secondary last year, made some plays as a wide receiver, now gets moved at the quarterback role. So interested to see how that works out. They definitely have some stud guys around him. Led the way with Jay Kesner, who's a tremendous two-way player at the tight end spot and also as an outside linebacker. Super 11 kid, Frank's finest kid for good reason. And a stud running back, Chris Luliano, who's a big-time lacrosse player. He's a guy who's, again, on Frank's finest, stud running back who really came onto the scene last year in B. I remember the question was, they're throwing the ball a lot. Can they establish a run game? He is a guy who exploded out on the scene for offensively and is going to be another really important player. Defensively, they're returning 5 of the 11 starters, but the talent is really all over the place. With them. Like, it's all over the field. Patrick McGuire on that offensive line coming back. I think Andrew Wilmarth at the linebacker spot, who was a real, again, stud for them in that B class. Super active linebacker. He also showed he can drop in coverage, had multiple INTs. I think he's moving to the offensive line from what I heard. But a couple other guys to keep an eye. Archer Fenton, one of my favorite safeties to watch. Scrappy, quick. Also plays the wide receiver spot. And you saw him make some plays in the section title game against Pleasantville. You also have Henry Schumacher, Tucker Hess. So there's a couple skill guys who can really step up for them. Going to have to replace a couple guys. But offensive line in the skill spot, interesting to see how they, step up this year. But Rye is super talented, Mars. I think they have close to 80 kids in the program. So depth is not a factor for them. They have those guys there. Thoughts, Mars, before we wrap it up?
I mean, Rye is obviously going to be a very dangerous team this year, no matter how many starters they have. It's very similar to what we see with Somers. They always have talent. I never not see a Rye team that's a good team. But the question is going to be about their star players. And I mean, I look at Chris Luliano and I say this kid is a beast, right? And you obviously have Jay Kessner, who's also very good. And I mean, I am not going to be surprised if they just start bringing back that wildcat formation and just start running people over. But in order for them to pull that off, you need to have a big offensive line like they did last year. And that's why I mentioned earlier in the video that I felt like of all the teams that could have competed with Somers' size, it was probably Rye, because they were both similar in stature and they both are running a very downhill offense. So I feel like that was a very interesting thing. So I wonder if Rye can continue doing that, or that they might have to maybe change up their scheme and maybe not have to use a wildcat for this. But they have a lot of athletes, and Rye is still going to be a problem. I am looking forward to watching the game again this year and seeing the battle between these two giants. But it's going to be a good season for Rye, I think.
Absolutely. And with that, guys, we are going to close on the show. Thank you guys so much, as always, for watching it. The games are a couple days away. Appreciate you guys, as always. Make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And with that, we'll see you all very soon.